Sometimes the reputation you build follows you whether you want it to or not. The guy who thought he could treat people however he wanted in a small industry, only to find out that both his old company and his new prospect had his number. The driver who treated a striped zone like a suggestion until a line of orange cones made following the rules easier than ignoring them. The manager who thought he could harass employees and punish anyone who spoke up until the person he tried to push out ended up running the place. Here we go. I left a toxic job without saying a word. Years later, the toxic guy applied to my new company. My mom is extremely successful in a very niche but very lucrative field. It's one of those industries where everybody knows everybody, reputations matter more than resumes, and opportunities don't come around often. Because of how well she did, my dad stayed home with me and my siblings, and we all grew up pretty comfortable. I had a good education, good support, and a very clear example of what success in that field looked like. The only downside was that her name carried a lot of weight, and I knew from the start that it could easily overshadow anything I did on my own. When I graduated, I chose to go into the same field, but made a conscious decision to keep my distance from her reputation. I used my dad's surname professionally and avoided mentioning who my mom was unless it was absolutely necessary. I didn't want doors opening for me because of her, and I definitely didn't want people assuming I was only there because of her. I also avoided working at her company, even though it would have been the easiest path. I wanted to build something that felt like mine, not just an extension of her success. In this industry, it's pretty standard to have a trial period before being officially hired. It gives both sides a chance to decide if it's a good fit without long-term commitments. I landed a trial position at one of the few companies in the field and went in determined to prove myself. I worked hard, showed up early, stayed late, and took on whatever was thrown at me. Most of my colleagues were great, and management seemed happy with my performance. One supervisor even joked that I was a workhorse, which I took as a compliment at the time. The only problem was one guy on the team. I'll call him Victor. From day one, Victor made it clear he wasn't interested in being friendly, professional, or even neutral. He had this constant need to undercut everyone around him like he was in some invisible competition that nobody else had signed up for. If someone got praised, he'd immediately jump in with, "That's nothing. I did something similar months ago." If someone mentioned struggling with the task, he'd roll his eyes and say, "It's not that hard, you're just overthinking it." It wasn't just me either. He treated everyone like that. But he seemed especially harsh toward women. I heard him make comments about how certain roles weren't for moms and how some people should focus on more appropriate priorities. It wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't professional. People complained quietly, but management tolerated him because he delivered results and had a reputation for being driven. Apparently, as long as the numbers looked good, the attitude was something they were willing to overlook. I tried to stay out of it and just focus on my work. I'm not confrontational, and I figured I could just ride out the trial period and make my decision at the end. But dealing with someone like that every day wears you down. Even if you're not the direct target, it changes the atmosphere, makes people hesitate to speak up, and turns normal conversations into something tense and awkward. By the time my trial period was ending, I already knew what I was going to do. When they offered me a permanent position, I thanked them and turned it down. I told them I appreciated the opportunity, but I didn't think it was the right fit for me long term. They were surprised, and a few people told me they'd miss me, which was nice to hear. Then Victor, in typical fashion, made sure to get the last word in, loud enough for half the office to hear. He said, "Knew you wouldn't last. Not everyone's cut out for this." I just smiled, said my goodbyes, and walked out. I didn't see the point in arguing with someone like that, especially when I knew I'd never have to deal with him again. I found another position at a different company not long after, and it was a completely different environment. People actually supported each other. Conversations felt normal, and I didn't feel like I had to brace myself every time someone opened their mouth. I settled in, did well, and eventually got promoted. Because the field's so small, my boss knew where I had done my trial period. Whenever we had applicants from that company, he'd casually ask me what my experience with them had been like. Most of the time, I had good things to say. Even if I didn't personally connect with someone, I could usually speak to their professionalism or work ethic. I don't go out of my way to tear people down, especially in a field where reputations travel fast. Then one day, my boss walked into my office with a resume in hand and asked, "Do you know this guy?" I looked at the name and almost laughed. It was Victor. For a second, I considered giving a vague answer and moving on, but my boss pressed a bit, clearly expecting something more detailed. I told him I can't be objective about him, which immediately got his attention. He asked what I meant, and I ended up telling him everything. The behavior, the constant belittling, the comments, the way he treated people. I didn't exaggerate or add anything extra, just laid it out exactly as I'd experienced it. My boss listened, nodded, and that was the end of the conversation. Victor didn't get the job, and I figured that was where the story ended. A few days later, I had dinner with my family. My mom casually mentioned that she'd seen an application from someone at my old company and asked if I knew him. When she said the name, I just shook my head and said, "Yeah, I know him." She already knew I'd had issues with someone there, so when I confirmed it was the same person, she didn't even need details. She just sighed and said, "All right, that's enough for me." Not long after, we hired someone else from that company, and that's when I heard what had actually been going on behind the scenes. Victor had actually been promoted, which apparently made things worse. Several good employees started leaving, and management finally had to look into why. His behavior, which they had ignored for so long, suddenly became a problem when it started affecting retention and hiring. From what I was told, they confronted him about it, and he didn't take it well. There was no self-reflection, no willingness to change, just more the same attitude that had caused the issues in the first place. Eventually, they let him go. After that, he started applying around, including to my company and my mom's. Neither of us hired him. I don't know what he's doing now, and honestly, I don't spend much time thinking about it. But I do think about how he treated people when he thought there would be no consequences. In a field this small, word gets around whether you like it or not. He spent a long time making sure people remembered him, just not for the reasons he probably wanted. He thought the problem was everyone else. He thought if he just kept pushing, kept delivering results, kept being the loudest voice in the room, it would all work out. But in a small field, people remember how you made them feel. And our second story. People treat our striped zone like a suggestion. I treated it like a construction site. They got the hint. I've been working at this gas station for about 3 years now, and for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward job. You deal with the usual mix of regulars, travelers, and the occasional person who thinks rules are more of a suggestion than an actual requirement. The one thing that consistently gets under my skin, though, is the no parking zone right along the front of the building. It's clearly marked with bright striping, big enough that nobody can pretend they didn't see it, and yet people ignore it like it's invisible. What makes it worse is that we have plenty of parking. There are actual parking spots on both sides of the building and pumps people can pull up to if they're just running in for a minute. I don't even care if someone leaves their car at the pump to grab a soda or a pack of cigarettes. It's not ideal, but at least it's not blocking a fire lane or creating a hazard. But that striped area, that's a hard no, and people still treat it like VIP parking. I've seen it all over the years. Someone pulls up, hops out, and says, "Oh, just be a second," like that magically makes it okay. Others don't even acknowledge it. They just park there like it's their personal reserved spot. If I catch it while they're still in the store, I'll politely point it out and ask them to move. Most people comply, some roll their eyes, and a few act like I just personally insulted them. Yesterday was a little different because we had paving crews coming in to redo half the lot. They'd already done one section during the day, and the rest was scheduled for the morning. Since I worked third shift, one of my responsibilities was to get everything ready for them before I left. That mostly meant moving cones and barriers into a neat, organized spot so the crew could easily grab them and set up without wasting time. The cones we use are those skinny orange ones, the kind you see everywhere, and around here people jokingly call them the state flower. We had 8 of them scattered around the lot, marking off the areas that had already been worked on. My instructions were simple: gather them up and place them together somewhere the crew could access them easily when they arrived. So I did exactly that. Except I didn't just toss them in a pile off to the side. I took my time and lined them up perfectly right down the middle of that no parking zone. Not randomly either. I spaced them evenly, nice and straight, like I was setting up a miniature runway of bright orange reminders that this area was not meant for cars. It looked intentional, because it was. I stepped back and admired it for a second. You couldn't miss it. If someone pulled up and thought about parking there, they'd have to physically move cones out of the way to do it. At that point, it's not ignorance anymore. It's a conscious decision. And if someone was going to go that far, at least I'd know exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. About 20 minutes later, right on cue, a guy pulled up and slowed down near the front. You could see him eyeing the spot, probably out of habit. Then he noticed the line of cones and just sat there for a second, like his brain was trying to process why his usual shortcut had suddenly turned into an obstacle course. He ended up driving around to an actual parking spot, which felt like a small victory. A little later, a regular came in and laughed when he saw it. "What's with the cone parade out there?" he asked, nodding toward the front. I shrugged and said, "Just making things easier for the paving crew." He smirked and said, "Yeah, easier for them and harder for the lazy ones." That's the real win, not the cones themselves, but the fact that the people who usually ignored the rule suddenly had to think twice. You didn't change the law, you just made following it slightly more convenient than breaking it. Sometimes that's all it takes. The best part was watching people hesitate. You could tell who was used to parking there because they'd slow down, glance at the cones, and then reluctantly choose a real spot. Nobody wanted to get out of their car, move cones, and then deal with whatever came next. It was just enough inconvenience to push them back into following the rules they'd been ignoring for years. By the time my shift was over, the cones were still exactly where I'd placed them, and the front of the store looked the way it was supposed to for once. No cars blocking the stripe zone, no awkward maneuvering around someone's parked vehicle, just a clear space like it was designed to be. It wasn't some grand fix, and I knew it probably wouldn't last forever, but for one shift, it worked perfectly. And our last story. I got my boss fired and took his job. I was about 19 when this happened, working at a Dunkin' in a small town where you start recognizing customers by their car engines before they even pull into the lot. By that point, I'd been there almost 2 years, long enough to know every shift inside out. I could run the front, the drive-thru, prep, closing, whatever needed doing. When we got a new manager, I was actually relieved at first. I'd helped train him on the day-to-day stuff, and he came off as easygoing, friendly, the kind of boss who didn't breathe down your neck every 5 seconds. For the first few months, things were smooth. He joked around, didn't micromanage, and generally let people do their jobs. Then, slowly, the tone shifted. It wasn't one big obvious moment, more like a bunch of smaller things that started adding up. Comments that felt off, jokes that weren't really jokes, and a weird habit of lingering a little too long around certain employees. I remember hearing him say to one of the girls, "Damn, you're really filled in today," like it was some kind of compliment. She laughed it off, but I was standing across the store thinking, did he really just say that out loud? That same girl and I hung out outside of work sometimes, and she told me he'd text her occasionally. Not anything explicit, just casual messages, but it still felt off. He was her boss. There's a line there, and he was clearly stepping over it like it didn't exist. She brushed it off, said it wasn't a big deal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had this big tattoo of his daughters on his shoulder, and I think that messed with my judgment a bit. It made him seem trustworthy, like he was a family guy, someone who couldn't possibly be crossing lines like that. So I kept second-guessing myself, telling myself maybe I was overreacting. That lasted until the day he decided to test how far he could push it with me. I just finished a conversation with him during my shift and turned to walk away. As I did, he whistled at me like I was a dog and followed it with a drawn-out, "Damn." I froze for a second, then turned back around. "Please stop," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That's not okay." I didn't yell, didn't make a scene, just set a boundary and left it at that. That whistle told you everything. It wasn't a mistake or a bad joke. It was him testing to see if you'd let it slide like everyone else had. When you said, "Please stop," you weren't just setting a boundary. You were telling him that his little game had a limit. He just didn't expect someone to actually enforce it. The look on his face told me everything. He didn't like being told no, especially not by someone he thought he could get away with that behavior around. He didn't argue with me in that moment, but the switch flipped instantly. The next day, I came in and checked the schedule. My hours had been cut from full-time to barely part-time almost overnight. When I asked about it, he didn't even pretend it was a coincidence. "You'll be on dish duty today," he said, tone sharp, like he was scolding me. I just stared at him for a second because there's no such thing as dish duty at Dunkin'. We had a sink, sure, but nobody got assigned to stand in the back all day like some kind of punishment detail, especially not someone who'd been there longer than everyone else on staff. What made it worse was the way he acted around everyone else. He'd snap at me in the back, then walk out front and switch right back to being the friendly manager, joking with customers and chatting up the other girls. It was so obvious it made my skin crawl. I spent that entire shift stuck in the back, scrubbing trays and trying not to lose my temper. The only upside was the customers. I knew their routines so well that I could usually have their orders ready before they even reached the counter. When they came in and I wasn't there, they noticed immediately. A few of them asked, "Where's she at today?" And he had to awkwardly say, "She's in the back." That meant longer waits, broken routines, and a noticeable drop in the smooth flow we usually had. By the time I got home that night, I was done being quiet about it. I sat down, found the corporate number, and called. I told them everything, from the comments to the whistling to the sudden schedule change. I didn't even know if anything would come of it, but I knew I wasn't going to just accept it and hope it fixed itself. The next day, I came in expecting more of the same. I was in the back again, halfway through another round of pointless busy work, when I saw a guy in a button-down shirt step behind the counter. He called my manager over and asked if they could talk. A few minutes later, they were sitting at a table in the lobby with another man I recognized as the owner of several local locations. I casually moved up front, pretending to check the register while keeping them in my line of sight. My manager glanced at me a couple of times, and I just stared right back, thinking, yeah, this is happening. The conversation didn't look friendly. No smiles, no joking, just serious expressions and a lot of talking from the two guys across from him. After about 10 minutes, they all stood up. My manager didn't come back behind the counter. He grabbed his things and walked straight out the door without saying a word to anyone. The two men came over to the register, and one of them asked, "Are you your name?" I nodded, and he said, "You did the right thing calling. He won't be coming back." I stood there for a second, letting that sink in. All the frustration from the past few weeks finally had somewhere to go, and for once, it didn't end with me being told to just deal with it. The next week, they asked if I wanted to step into the manager role. I said yes, without hesitation. Last I heard, he ended up managing a fast food place on the other side of town. Same attitude, different uniform. Meanwhile, I got to run a store where nobody had to wonder if setting a boundary would cost them their job. For me, story 3 lands hardest. Victor's reputation caught up with him, and the cones worked for a night. But the manager's downfall was immediate and total. He thought his power came from his title, that he could take away shifts, assign pointless work, and silence anyone who said stop. He didn't realize that the 19-year-old he was trying to break had already built a reputation of her own. With the customers, with the regulars, with the customers, with the regulars, with the people who actually kept the store running. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.